comments if we don't have time to address yours. Finally, we want to thank you for being with us today. We're so grateful to our family of loyal customers, keeping our business and our spirits afloat. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. John Archibald is a current Nieman Fellow at Harvard and a columnist for the Alabama Media Group. His columns appear in the Birmingham News, the Huntsville Times, the Mobile Press Register, AL.com, and its social brand Reckon. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Commentary in 2018. Tonight, he's in conversation with Michael Harriot. Harriot is a critically acclaimed poet, journalist, and broadcaster, and a senior writer for TheRoot.com. Please join me in welcoming them both to PNP Live.
So I guess first I want to thank you, Politics and Prose, and John Archibald for having me. And I want to let the audience know that we haven't worked up a script and John has also let me know that there isn't anything off limits. And you should also know that when you see me looking down, it's I'm one of those people who actually write things down. So I'm looking at note sites when I read the book and some commentary that I might have. So I'm not just shy or staring at the ground. So, one of the things that I noticed about the book, I want to say that, some of the people watching may not know that I live in Birmingham, Alabama also. I've been living here for about 12 years. So I've kind of familiarized myself. I went to school at Auburn, which is not far from here. But so I am kind of a replanted Alabama native. And so it's interesting to me. One of the things that I found interesting about the book is growing up in Alabaster, John. There's a through line, I think that permeates throughout the book of silence. I think it's, two through lines in the book, right? Your family's influence and the culture of silence when it comes to racism, white supremacy. But I always think that people, where they grew up, how they grew up, and just the simple idea of how many sisters you had, how many brothers you had, whether you had two parents or one parent household, or whether you grew up with your grandmother, that kind of informs a lot of how you are as a person for the rest of your life. So talk about your family, please don't skip over the part about your brother's plays and how that upbringing informed you in your life.
Yeah, well, well, first of all, thank you for coming. I live in Birmingham too, and I get to read you a lot, well, like everybody else, and I really appreciate what you do, and I appreciate you being here. But I was born in Alabaster, Alabama, which was in April of 1963, which anybody who knows anything about the history of Birmingham and civil rights knows that's a very important time. It's the moment of the Children's Crusade, moment when Dr. King was jailed there. And my father was a Methodist preacher. His father was a Methodist preacher. His father was a Methodist preacher. Grandfather on the other side was a Methodist preacher, whole deal. So we were very much entrenched in that church. And I was the last of four kids, two brothers and a sister. And I was the one who pretty much got away with everything, I think, because of that. But the essence of it is that we were all, these preachers' kids, who after Alabaster, my dad moved to, climbed the corporate ladder of what I guess I call Jesus LLC in the book, to bigger and better churches, bigger congregations, nicer parsonages, bigger salaries, more money, which I came to learn sort of as in looking at that book came with not making waves in the 60s. It came with sort of having a pulpit and talking about the problems in faraway places and not the ones right outside your stained glass windows. So I think all my brothers and sisters, for the most part, kind of grew up in, like most people, I mean, like most white people of my generation in Alabama grew up having no freaking idea what was going on right outside their doors, and spending a life growing up where the schools didn't teach them, where the churches didn't teach them, where the parents didn't teach them. And so we still have an incredible amount of ignorance about what took place right outside our doors.
So that's one of the things that interests me, because being born in '63, and I would imagine that by the time you're 8, 9, 10 years old, in Alabaster, it may have seemed like the problems of the civil rights movement and that history was in the past. So did you see from the white people you were around, did it seem like they were done with it and had moved on and figured they had cured the race problem? Or did they seem like they were trying to return to it? They were bitter about it.
Yeah. By the time I was that old, we had moved to Decatur, but and by that time, I mean, by 1971, I was, schools had finally been integrated. Then it was a different world. It was not. I mean, it was. We thought it was a different world, but very, very clearly, by that time, white people in Alabama thought, oh, we have moved on. So anything that happened in the 60s was something you look back and said, oh, look what somebody else did. That doesn't have anything to do with us, which is both a serious error and much of the point of this book, because what happened from the beginning was this conspiracy of silence that says, you don't talk about it. It's the whole thing with the outside agitators that the language was always used. It's the whole thing that somebody else did this. Somebody else is responsible for this. It's those terrible guys burning crosses in people's yard and setting bombs at 16th Street Baptist Church and beating Fred Shuttlesworth outside the school and beating John Lewis on a bridge. Those are the people who did this. But none of those things, Alabama's Constitution, which was, as created for the specific stated purpose of establishing white supremacy as law, could never have happened if white people who thought better had said something about it. Jim Crow could never have happened. The Tuskegee experiments could not have happened. The voter suppression could not have happened. The Birmingham could not have happened. The 16th Street Baptist Church couldn't have happened if people who, and of course this was what King was saying all along, from the letter from a Birmingham jail, about people, who knew better but said nothing. And so that's really what got me started looking at it. It's like, I know my dad knew better. I love him and respect him still greatly. He's the most principled person I ever know. But if a person that you revere so had trouble finding courage in a critical moment in time, in a critical place in time, what can that do? What can that tell us about how we want to react today? When, let's face it, we face the exact same questions, and we're seeing some of the exact same answers that white people gave in 1960 or 63 or 65.
So it's like, I guess we could dig into those statements for the rest of the time we're talking. And so one of the things that I'm like, not being a Birmingham native, I always have to be careful of, is because most people outside of Birmingham, there's a knowledge about the civil rights era just from being in Birmingham that we assume like everybody knows, right? Like we assume that most people know about 16th Street Baptist Church. We assume that everybody knows about Birmingham and that everybody knows about the letter from a Birmingham jail. So, one of the things I think it's important to do right here is to kind of tell the story of that in 1963, a group of white supremacists bombed 16th Street Baptist Church, which is, the most significant church. And that is not what made it significant. It was a significant center of the civil rights movement before that. And they bombed it, killing 4 little girls on early one Sunday morning. And the repercussions from that is that, like, people think that is why it is called Birmingham. But you mentioned in your book that, oh no, it's and talk about that. It's more than just that.
A lot of people think that because that's the most famous, and that was the most shocking to people, and that it was an explosion that really was heard around the world. So people think that, but there were more than 40 bombings in Birmingham between the 40s and the 60s in 1965, and it was called Birmingham long before that. And people think that the 16th Street bombing was so impactful that it stopped bombings in Birmingham. But no, that's not true either, because they kept coming for several years after that, and no arrests were made for decades. So it began really when middle-class Black people began to move into that famous neighborhood known as Dynamite Hill, when real estate it was ruled unconstitutional to discriminate on the basis of real estate. I mean, I didn't say that well, but so people started moving in, and Klansmen from that notorious clavern in East Birmingham started bombing civil rights attorneys' houses and churches and people who dared to move into this neighborhood, and that neighborhood also has another story that's just fantastic as well, because it grew people like Angela Davis, and it grew people like Oscar Adams, Alabama's first Black Supreme Court justice, and lawyers and federal judges, and an amazing array of incredible people who grew up in an environment where they had to patrol their own streets because people would come by and bomb. And I digress, all that. But Birmingham was tumultuous, and it was, and the level at which, and you said we were in Birmingham, so we know that. I mean, I think that's true, but I think the level at which that's not true is incredible. And if you start asking people in the suburbs, particularly, to tell you what's in the letter from a Birmingham jail, they will look at you funny. If you ask them if they've ever been to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, they will tell you no. And if their kids had been, they went on a field trip. And the level of ignorance about the critical things that happened in our city, despite the fact that we talk about them all the time, is shocking. And I experienced that. And it's not from a parent who was racist. He was one who wanted me to go to integrated schools, who wanted to integrate scout troops, who wanted to bring people in. But he could not talk about it in a way that informed me about what was happening. He could not talk about it from the pulpit because his career would be threatened, I suppose. And you find that over and over again, not just in churches, which were really, really, really culpable in this. The white churches, not just in Birmingham, but across the South, but also in, of course, boardrooms where it continues, and in all elements of society. You can look at a lot of people who talk about how much they had to sacrifice because they spoke out on race. Not a lot of people. There are very few white people who did that. And many will tell you how they sacrificed, which I understand, but it still can't seem to match the sacrifice from those people we talked about earlier.
So, one of the stories you talk about in the book is going away to camp. And I'd like you to kind of tell that story of a Black person being invited just to speak at your camp.
Yeah, this would have been before I was born. This was in 1953, I think. and I'm a preacher's kid,
Right.
and so camp was really important to us because we moved all around, but we would go to camp, these church camps, and as it happened at the time, my dad was an official in the conference in some way, a youth official that was in charge of the camp, and he had a friend who worked there, and she knew this fellow named Julius Scott, who was a friend of hers, who would go on to, he's a brilliant man who would go on to be college presidents and a top official in the Methodist Church nationally. And he was a brilliant man. He still is. And he just happened to be Black. And so when she decided she wanted to invite him to camp in 1953 to talk to the kids, to preach to the kids, to, just do what he did, they had to go before this committee to say, is this okay for us to do? And they said, yeah, he can come. And my grandfather was on this committee. But they said there have to be a couple of caveats to that, because, people ask questions. So when he's eating, he can't eat with those kids. He's going to have to eat at a table all by himself, okay? And you're going to have to put a sign up that says, this table's for Julius Scott, and that's it. And when he sleeps, he can't, room with anybody else. He's going to have to sleep right here. And, it's not, let's just put him over here in this health room instead of a regular room. So he'll be away from everybody else. And so the woman who invited him, Nina Reeves, said, well, that's ridiculous. We're not going to do that. But Julius Scott said, if they're going to ask me to come down, I'm going to come down. And he came down. And the first day he ate at his table by himself, and he slept in his room by himself. And but then by the next day, as it was told to me, all the kids just said, let's go sit with him because this is dumb. And they got to know him a little bit, and they loved him, and so that was told to me as this big success story, and somebody roomed with him too, so he wasn't alone, although I don't know if people really like that. But when I talked to Julius Scott about this, he was 93, I think, at the time, and he said, it was a great success story because of the courage of Nina Reeves. But then I asked some more questions, which is always the thing that gets you in trouble, right? And so instead of being this great success story, she told me a little bit more. And that was that, because these kids in 1953 started to see him as a person, they began to walk with him out on the Vesper Trail, and he was seen by someone walking with a 12-year-old talking outside the cafeteria or whatever it is. And the shit hit the fan. And all of a sudden they're saying, Nina Reeves, you're going to be fired, and this cannot happen again. So they have to go back before that board that has already approved it in advance. They said, yeah, you can come, to see whether she would be fired. And she did, she was telling me, that my dad probably saved her job and all this, and which was great, again, to make me feel better. But and then the kicker comes out that this board, which included my grandfather, said, we did tell you you could invite Mr. Scott, and so we can't fire you, but we don't think we need any more Black people at Camp Simatonga. So you get to stay, but they fired all the Black cooks.
Yeah, Julius Scott stayed.
Julius Scott, right. He could come. We don't really want him to come back. He was there for a week. He's gone. You get to keep your job, but all the Black cooks don't get to keep theirs, which was, to me, as a person who always felt like, who went to camp where they literally taught me to sing these songs about red and yellow, black and white, Jesus loves all the children of the world, where they literally taught me that, to act so completely hypocritically was a punch in the gut. And to have, you know, that personal involvement to it made it much worse.
So one of the interesting things is that earlier you said that, you know, your father and your grandfather were, you know, two of the most principled people you've ever known. Like, how do you reconcile them, or you thinking of them as principled? And with that silence, with that, like, you know, knowing what is going on in the country and knowing that they could have an impact. And because, in my opinion, like, to not say anything is a choice as much as saying something, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, right. So you choose, right? Like, you have in Birmingham in the 60s and even in the 70s and then even in Decatur in Georgia, like, you have to choose not to talk about race. Like, it's not like you can avoid it. You have to make a conscious choice that either I'm going to not talk about the most pressing issue in the society that we live in today, or I'm going to just, like, talk about it as a human being, right? So how do you marry those two things, right? Like, them being people and men of God, and them allowing one of the most evil things in society to exist, partly because nobody says anything.
Exactly that, and that quest to understand that is the book. So I mean, the basis of the book, and much of it, and it's hard to reconcile. It's impossible for me to reconcile because I love him, and I want to hold him accountable, and I want to understand as well. And I think that I can't. I mean, and it causes me a lot of disappointment. But, you know, again, to go back to that letter, you know, as King said, you know, he was disappointed in the church, but he still loved it. And you can only have great disappointment where you have great love. And so that's where it comes. But, you know, I talked to a lot of preachers of his generation about this and how does this happen? How does this happen? I mean, you can get up and preach constantly using parables of the Good Samaritan and all these things that you hope are going to rub off on people, but you never say, look outside the door. What we're doing to people is sinful and terrible, and we should be ashamed of ourselves. I mean, and why does nobody say that? I mean, even when the preachers who did talk about it, they talked about it in terms of the race question or the race issue, and there would be hints of things about prejudice or pride or bias and those things. But the preachers all inevitably said, you know, if I talk about race today, I'm going to be looking for a church tomorrow. And that if, you know, he did it for you so that you would have a better life. You would have a better life. You would be in a better position, and he'd have more money, and we'd have better houses. And they told me this as if it was an excuse, as if it was supposed to make me feel better about those failures you talk about, because the problem of seeing the person you admire the most fail to do what needed to be done at that moment, to say what needed to be said at that critical time, was very difficult. Part of this journey was to, as my wife's telling me on the chat, to look at his evolution through the years. And there was quite a bit of evolution through the years. And I do think that it is important to recognize that we can screw up today and do better tomorrow. But it doesn't explain the silence in that critical moment. And it's just so unlike the person that I knew, which is why I wanted to tell the story of this quest, and part of the, you know, it kind of alternates between this quest and this person I knew, and how they don't always add up. But I think it was epidemic, not just in the Methodist church, but in the white church in general, and I think it remains so today.
So, do you think that your father's church, your father and your father's church, like was, you can read this book as a microcosm of the South in general, right? Like,
I hope so.
The condemnation or the quest for your father's, what you imagine was morality, except in this blind spot where, he was not courageous. Do you think it's a microcosm of the South? Like how, not just the South, and I want to be intentional about that, because this is not a Southern thing, right? But the idea that you can be a good person while being complicit in evil, because in the South, very few people have as much effect on the society's lives as a preacher, especially in the 60s and the 70s and the 50s, right? Do you think it's kind of a microcosm of the excuse that the South could use, that they could imagine themselves a good person?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the question that haunted me throughout this thing. And it's not just the South, it's a global thing. We have to understand this is a global thing. And the South, in a lot of ways, becomes the microcosm for it all now, because we always focus on what the South did. But yeah, I mean, on one hand, I'm sitting here thinking, with every word I write in this book is, when was I silent? When are the moments that I didn't say the things that needed to be said? God knows, we both write a lot of opinion a lot of the time, and I imagine both of us have gotten some of it wrong sometimes. And so we learn to live with those things because we take those things. But when are the moments we were silent for whatever reason about whatever issue it was? So, I mean, that haunted me on one hand. But the other hand is, I mean, but what really was getting me is, I just kept thinking what you were talking about just then. If we have a pulpit, and that doesn't mean a religious pulpit necessarily, it could mean a secular pulpit. And your pulpit could be, the Root or where I write, AL.com, Birmingham, it could be any of those things, or it could be sitting around the table with somebody who's saying racist things. It could be any moment where somebody says something that you think needs to be challenged on a moral level and you don't. So, I mean, I think that what I hope of this book is, people say it's a book about my dad, and maybe it is. But I look at it as a book that uses my dad as a vehicle to talk about us right now and in the future, because again, if people of goodwill fail to speak, then I'm not one to talk about things like sin very often, but if there's such a thing as sin, I think that silence is it.
So I'm going to take a question from one of the audience members. They're asking about what we're talking about now, this silence. And she asked, this is what James Cone wrote about at length, and how the white church failed society, but so did some Black churches. Were you or your family of preachers aware of James Cone's work?
Not intimately, no.
Right. So, he wrote about, and I think there's a quote about, like the church exists for this reason, like James Cone wrote that the reason for the church's existence was not to go worship on Sundays and to make people feel better about the things that they were already doing, or to tell people to read the Bible. It was for this, right? Like, what purpose does a church serve? And I think he called it like the prophetic existence. What purpose a church serves if not for this, right? What is your purpose in society if you are the representative of the word of God, if not to make society better. So, so one of the things that you talk about in the book too, right, in expanding this theme out wider, is the culture of Alabama and the South, where it was not just silent, but resistant, and how it embedded these ideas in people's heads. And one of the things that I love is that you gave an excerpt from the books, from your textbooks that you use, where, this openly talked about, well, the people in the South, they were fighting in the Civil War because they had the right to own slaves, and how the Klan was just the representative of the people, and how, the white people in the South, the Black people in the South ended up being loyal to the white Southerners. And how do you think, like, it's not just silence, but the reinforcing of those values perpetually, right? Because those kinds of books in some kind of dog whistle way still exist in South Carolina. I mean, in Alabama. How do you think those ideas perpetuated themselves into this stagnation that we see now, right? Like this, the attitudes in many ways haven't changed. I know, the audience might not know this, but like, if you, like, prior to maybe 2 years ago, if you ever wanted to experience some of the most vitriolic, combative dialogue that you ever wanted to see in America, you just could go into the AL.com comment section. So much so that they just did away with it. Like,
thank God.
With commenting on articles, because it was essentially like a right wing versus, like, everyone else is the devil, right? But it gives you an insight into the larger society and the idea of how people view progress in this state and in the country, right? And how do you think those ideas embed themselves and perpetuate themselves in intergenerational?
Oh my God, every way. I mean, it's funny. We look now. If you take a modern look at it, well, just look at Georgia. Okay, Georgia made great strides in the election, and so immediately there's a snapback to limit voter rights and to take a step back, one step forward, two steps back again, and you go back. I mean, again, that's exactly what happened when Alabama wrote its Constitution after Reconstruction. Black people got power. We rewrote the Constitution. Didn't really work. We rewrote the Constitution again with the express written, for white supremacy. Same thing with Jim Crow. Same thing with everything. Every time there's a step forward, there's a step back. But the part about the textbooks, I mean, I think it all really does it stem from the whole lost cause movement, which is the movement, to rewrite history of the Civil War so that the South was glorious and noble and all those things. And the textbooks that you speak of, which was a 4th grade textbook called No Alabama, that all Alabama kids were essentially required to read. And there were many different versions over the years, but the one that was quoted in the book, as you talk about, I mean, I wish I could find it and read it real quick, but I mean, it essentially said, that the Klan patrolled the woods at night to keep people safe, and that sometimes when Black people misbehaved, they had to be punished. And in some cases that required that they, quote, leave the state. We usually, as we know now, many of them left the state on the limb of a tree in that situation, of course. And it went on to say that eventually, after the Klan ran the carpetbaggers out of Alabama, that the Black people realized who their friends were and began to stay at home and work hard in Alabama. And this is what people of my generation or just before were learning in their fourth grade classes in Alabama. And so you look at people who, who refuse to understand the truth of history and prefer this romantic, from a white perspective, from a white racist perspective, view of history, because it leaves them blameless. And as long as we're able to all look at ourselves as white people and say we're blameless, we didn't do it, then nothing ever changes, which is why my main hope of this book is that people will look at themselves.
Right. So one of the things that you talk about, and is that how that permeates itself into the politics of Alabama. I often tell people, right, like, when they look at Georgia and see the shift in Georgia, they wonder, well, maybe we could do this in Alabama. And I was like, no, I mean, it's impossible.
And you don't understand.
Because no matter how bad the candidate on the Republican side is, they have embedded the thought that to vote for a Democrat is against their religion. It's literally against their religion. It's anti-Jesus if you support a Democrat, right? So it doesn't matter the quality. That's why we had Roy Moore could make a serious run at the Senate, because, Doug Jones beat him by the hair. It was hailed as a victory, but you have to think about, like, we almost had Roy Moore as a senator. Roy Jones probably would have been.
Roy Jones would be way better.
Yeah. But
yeah, but Tommy Tuberville's maybe worse than Roy Moore would have been. I mean, it's and Mo Brooks in Alabama is now using Stephen Miller as a campaign tool in Alabama. So it's when people that I would argue are reasonable people say, what is going on there? It just simply, they use that as a campaign tool too, because all that does is represent that they've made, the liberal establishment angry, so they must be the best thing since sliced white bread.
So knowing that, do you feel, because you're known for pushing up against that establishment, right? Like, do you feel like you've made any progress with your writing and your?
I mean, at times I've been doing this a long time. I've been doing this for a long time, and there have been times that I felt I made great progress. And there are we talk about Alabama as if it's one big thing, and it's not. And there are a lot more people in Alabama who are thoughtful and who want to change things than anybody recognizes. It's just not a number that's going to be a majority. But right now, no. The answer is an unequivocal no. I feel like sometimes I do more harm than good just by saying that things are wrong. And, you've got to kind of weigh how much you say, which again causes me to think about what I'm writing about. Silence. You can't be silenced, even if it doesn't work, right? So you've got to keep finding better ways to be more persuasive, or using different tones, or finding different mediums to do it. But I've never been as frustrated as I've been lately, because I'm, as I said, born in 1963, grew up in Alabama, lived through Wallace, lived through all those sorts of things. And I don't think I've ever seen the state, and not just the state, but the country, to be in a state where they are no longer ashamed of their racism. Because I think for most of my life after from the 70s on, for sure, I think people began to be ashamed of that. Ashamed to say it out loud anyway, at least where they might be heard. And I don't think that that's true anymore.
So one of the watchers wanted to ask about the anti-riot legislation. And specifically, she wanted to know, like, how can we use the lessons of the past to convince our ultra-conservative state lawmakers to vote against it? And how do we get people to pay more attention to the erosions to freedom of assembly then and now?
Well, that's a really difficult question, and I would love to have pointers, because reason doesn't work, knowledge doesn't work, an understanding of history doesn't work, a baseball bat, a rhetorical baseball bat, does not work. So it seems like everybody has just gone over so far that that there's no talking to anyone. This discussion of religion doesn't help because the religions are so vastly different. I might say, well, Jesus said, love each other, the Sermon on the Mount, all these sorts of things, and they'll find something, they'll pick another notion in the Bible that it more suits their needs. I think that ultimately for me, the only time I'm ever successful in doing that is when and it's very difficult in a pandemic to do, is to go try to talk to people one-on-one. Because somehow or other, when you can look into somebody's eyes and talk to them, and you can say, I think this, or, you tell me what you think and why, and you can have a conversation, then at least all of the vitriol that appears on social media or that appears in our comments at the time, doesn't exist. And so I think that when we're able to talk to each other as people, we have a much better chance of that. But usually, I think we both have to admit that what we do in large part is preaching to the choir. And I've never felt that to such a degree as I feel right now.
Right, and you mentioned earlier, like, you've in your lifetime, you haven't seen a time where they were, the large majority of people or so large a swath of people were content with airing their racism out. Why do you think it's regressed? What do you think led to that regression? It's easy to point at like one guy and say Trump, or but why do you think that is? It has to be more than just one guy, right?
Well, I would argue that it began in the early 90s with Rush Limbaugh and Newt Gingrich, and kind of progressed along the way, went to more extreme voices. I think that the presidency of Obama triggered a lot of racist activity on the internet. I think the internet, of course, itself played a role. But I think I could notice during the Obama presidency, just the level of emails that came to me from organizations that represented right-wing groups that were inherently disgustingly racist began to emerge. I think that after that, I think Trump gave it voice, and now much of the party accepts it as something that gets votes, which is less a statement about any of those people we talked about just then, and more a statement about this country.
Right. So do you think it is a sentiment that has been in existence since Martin Luther King wrote that letter from a Birmingham jail, and just has been like suppressed? People wouldn't openly talk and communicate like that until it was cool to do so again? Or do you think it was rising, the trend was rising? Because you talk about those letters, you talk about those, those emails. Do you think Rush Limbaugh and those organizations and that party was stoking something that already existed, or do you think they were building a fight?
I think they understood, intuitively or otherwise, that it was politically volatile, and they could be exploited. And I think the numbers show that. But I also think now, it's unfair to say it started then. Because this is the same thing. Everything we're talking about existed, for 400 years, right? It all existed forever. It was just this brief, tiny moment in time after the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. Excuse me, after the King's assassination, Malcolm X and Bobby Kennedy, and people, I think, and after the 60s just became, there was a dawning that this is messed up. And I think that the shame a lot of people felt about it may have been from some guilt, or it may have been just fear that they would be canceled. Didn't exist in the 60s, I guess, but that they felt that they would be shamed and they would be seen as less than if they showed their racism overtly, and that just seems to be over.
Right. So, and I think one of the things that, especially some of the audience, especially politics and pros in DC might not know is, when we talk about Confederate flags flying in the Capitol, we see them every day, literally every day in Alabama. You will see somewhere, if you drive from home to work, you will see a Confederate flag. So the people who wrote that textbook that you talk about when you were in the 4th grade, their grandkids, it's not like you've gone anywhere. They've raised children who raised their grandchildren to revere that flag. And so that sentiment from 63, the people who were bombing and spitting on little girls who were trying to integrate the schools, really hadn't, it's what, 2 generations, it hasn't really gone anywhere, right? Because there's been nothing to dismantle it, right?
Right, and those children hear way more about the egregious efforts to remove Confederate monuments than they do about people being killed and beaten and denied the basic rights they take for granted. And, as the world has this alleged racial reckoning in the wake of George Floyd, the Alabama legislature is again trying to figure out how to better protect its Confederate monuments. They're talking about making it illegal to put up context around a monument to explain that these were put up in the 20th century by people who wanted to recast the memory of the movement or any other context. And it's mind-boggling. And again, I won't repeat myself again, but
yeah, I think it's worth repeating that, this is because I think when we talk about, most of the country sees what's going on in the country, and they see a scattered few people here and a scattered few people there. And, they can't imagine being surrounded by, we are in a majority of those people, right? It is rarer to find someone who doesn't think those things than does think those things.
Outside of a place like Birmingham.
Right. And I think that's important to know. There are large parts of the country where the things that most people assume would be so despicable that you wouldn't say them out loud aren't in the southern part of the country, right? It is the normal thing to hear. And so I'm gonna go to some more questions. If I could just pull up a couple of more questions. that people wanted to ask because you've had a lot. So there is, one says, where did your grandfather and your father stand on the issue of voter suppression, on redlining, and on other racist policies? Did you know? And
I knew my dad. I mean, well, I don't know about my grandfather. My grandfather died when I was 2. He was in a car wreck when I was 2 and was left pretty much unable to speak. But I know my dad. My dad always made efforts in the area of equality. But as you talked about before, I mean, this is in his private life. I mean, in his life outside the church, he was extremely interested in equality. But you sort of alluded to it earlier, is that, but he also had this firm belief that you didn't mix politics with the pulpit, which is which in and of itself, as a professor named Bill Nicholas mentioned in the book, when you make that decision to keep politics out of the pulpit, you are making a political decision. And to pretend it is something else is disingenuous. And so, no, I mean, my dad in no way was someone who would have supported voter suppression and would have been opposed to that. But would he have had the ability early on in his career anyway to speak it from the pulpit? I don't know.
Do you think if he would have spoken out or just said something, what would the response have been? Like, we say you'll get in trouble, but like, will somebody go report him and say he's talking good about Black people?
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes. I mean, that's the remarkable thing. That's what's so messed up. I mean, preacher after preacher says, that in the Methodist church anyway, they have preachers, and then they have district superintendents who are their bosses, and then the bishop over that. And in many cases, the district superintendents would tell those preachers, don't be talking about the race issue, as they called it, or the race question, which again is like it's a question. And some did anyway. Some brought it up, and they would be kept in small churches for the rest of their career, or they would be removed. They would not have jobs in the state, and they'd be moved to New England or somewhere where, and so they'd be ostracized. And again, these stories were always told generally as a way to make it seem understandable, and I suppose it is, because again, I should say, you can never go back and know what anybody would do in another place and time with any degree of surety. We would hope that I would behave a certain way, but I can't be guaranteed that I would. But all we can do is look back at those people that we admire or don't, and we can see what they did or did not do, and we can use that to inform us about how we want to react to comparable situations today, which would be voter suppression and redlining and all the things mentioned. And there's been silence on those issues. I mean, how many times have you written about redlining in your life? And I mean, I've written a few times, and it's, white people do not care. They do not want to know.
Yeah. This is one of the things that I'm obsessed with. So
yeah, I mean, I have been at times.
Yeah.
Myself.
So, but another one of the viewers wanted to know, how do you think this, like, your attitude towards race and about, I guess you would describe you as left-leaning. Is that reflected in your sisters, your brothers?
Oh yeah. I mean, my whole family was that way. My dad, I mean, he would never admit it, because he kept politics separate, and he wasn't the type to put you didn't put bumper stickers on cars or signs on. I mean, it was sort of a journalist-like way in the preacher. But I mean, all of my brothers and sisters, my mother and father, they were all felt that way. That's why it was such a shock to me. And when I first got started in this, it's after my dad died, and I assumed he had always said the right thing. because of this. And I found every sermon he'd ever given in my basement in a file cabinet left to me. And that's when I started reading it. And the first one I read was from the week after the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama. And that, for people who don't know, is when Fred Shuttlesworth and Dr. King came to town, and they organized marches, and children marched and were arrested. And thousands of children, thousands of Black children were arrested in Birmingham and taken to jail. And that's when the dogs and the fire hoses came out and all that. But the week after the Children's Crusade happened to be Children's Sunday on the church calendar in my dad's church, and he preached about children, and he preached about that how we needed to have the faith, the trust like children, and that sort of thing. But there wasn't a mention of the kids who were in jail 23 miles away in Birmingham, and there wasn't a mention of that, and it hit me hard because I would have expected something else, and so then I had to look at the dates of the Selma to Montgomery March and the 16th Street bombing, and as the years passed, there was much more of a progression, but the one that got me the most was that and it's in a chapter called "Too Late" in the book, in which my dad is preaching a sermon on September 15th, 1963, in a sermon that is called "Too Late," and in it he makes his first real mention of prejudice and pride. It's still vague and small, but it's there. And I realized as he gave this sort of tepid response to hate, at the very moment he was giving it, that usher in the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham heard that click, and those four little girls in that basement who were tying sashes on each other and getting ready to go upstairs were killed in that explosion. And it just struck me so vividly that, on one hand, you're trying to find a voice that you just can't find, and you're preaching a sermon called "Too Late," and all of a sudden that bomb goes off, and it is too late. And I compare that to the voices of others, to the sacrifices of others, and it's stark.
I think it's a powerful book. I think, as some people would know, maybe it's like, this is the thing I scream about all of the time, is silence is the cure. Not being silenced is the cure for all of this. And so I think it's a book that not only people will enjoy just for the stories of a family and your background, but it's kind of like, to me, the origin story of how we got here, right? Like a microcosm of the origin story of all of the families around the country, to how we got here and how we really haven't moved past what we needed to do, because we just stopped talking about it and pretended it was fixed because we stopped talking about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest lessons in that book.
Well, thank you. I think the thing about it is, it was so surprising, to us as a family, is because and I think we're a microcosm of a lot of white families in Alabama who have culpability and don't realize it, because we always thought that we knew better and believed better and were more accepting. And, we'd be gladly, put Black Lives Matter flags in our yard, and we'd gladly do all those things. And we never really knew just the level. I mean, we were the good people, right? But no, it was the good people who were silent that allowed all this to happen. And that's not just in 1963. And it's not, it's now and it's tomorrow. And I hope that's hope that just seeing it develop then can make us kind of see ourselves now.
Right. So it looks like we're out of time. This flew by so fast. I'd like to thank all of the people who came and watched, participated, and asked questions. I tried to get to all of the questions. You will go see some people have comments, and they just wanted to tell you things. So you'll see that in the Q&A. But I do thank everyone for participating, for watching, and for asking questions. And I want to thank you. And I guess I will turn it over to you two and let you have your last words.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us this evening. And thank you everyone out there for coming. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this. And we cannot continue to host these events without the book sales to support them. Please support our author and Politics and Prose by using this link, the link in the chat, to purchase Shaking the Gates of Hell, a search for family and truth in the wake of the Civil Rights Revolution. Please take a moment to visit our website for the most up-to-date event listings, and we do hope to see you there. And thank you both so much for joining us this evening. And everyone out there, stay healthy and stay well read, and we'll see you next time.
And read Michael Harriot's piece in the Root today. It was fire.
Thank you.
Thank you.